Hi there, this is Kylie from Beginner to Van Gogh. I'm going to start teaching you how to draw landscapes. If it wasn't for lockdown, we would have started landscapes this week. And we would have done an introduction to landscapes. So that's exactly what it is that I'm going to do with you today. Okay, so first of all, what I want you to do, all right, is we're going to have a go at completing a very simple landscape, looking at how we can create a bit of distance in the artwork. Okay, but first of all, landscape is all about mark making. All right, now we've done mark making in previous lessons, or sessions, so therefore we are very good, very expert at using marks. Now we need to use marks in order to create distance. So in order to explore the wide variety of marks out there in the landscapes, what I would like you to do is head out into your garden, okay, or take a little book out into your community, your village, Dunnington, etc. And I would like you to go out and do some rubbings. Okay, now I've done these rubbings with just normal art chalk. Okay, so that's rubbings from one of the brick walls in the garden. Okay, this is from the slabs. Okay, and we've got some from my patio floor. Okay, and then they started to try and do some grass. I think it picked up the bumps in the grass and the stones. Okay, now the way in which I've done these very different rubbings is I've started off using a black chalk or pastel. Then I've used a grey chalk, and then I've used a white chalk. So the white chalk actually picks up some of the highlights. All right, what this does is it then provides you with a wide variety of marks that you can potentially use in your landscape. All right, you can have a go, depending on how adventurous you are. You could have a go at doing a leaf, you can have a go at doing grass, etc, etc. Now if you haven't got any chalk, you could just use the side of your pencil, okay, in order to create a rubbing. All right, I've also given you here a Van Gogh landscape using marks. Okay, so you're going to use these marks that Van Gogh has got and combine them with those that you've actually created or developed in your little sketchbook or on loose sheets of paper. All right, and I prefer to work with printed out squares, but you don't need to, of course. You could just draw squares in your sketchbook, or you could just draw them freehand. All right, so you're going to draw 6 squares, and what I want you to do is start off with foreground. Okay, you're going to do 2 squares as foreground, you're going to do 2 squares as middle ground, and you're going to do 2 squares as background. Okay, and we're going to explore the variety of marks, how they change in between each ground. All right, so if we go back to Van Gogh, all right, in order to create distance and in landscapes, you have a foreground, which is the ground that is in the centre. Okay, you then have your middle ground, okay, which is around about midway into the landscape, and then you have your background here. All right, so you try and divide it up into three segments. Okay, the foreground. Generally, the marks in the foreground, they are bigger. As you can see, you can identify the marks are a lot larger, basically because you can see them in greater detail. Okay, and they are also, if you take a look really carefully, they are generally a little bit further apart. Whereas if you compare them to those in the background up here, okay, they are quite a lot closer. All right, and the marks are generally a little bit smaller. So we need to be thinking about this when we're doing the foreground, middle ground and background. Okay, the way that I remember foreground, all right, it is forward. All right, so it's the most forward part of the landscape. Okay, You also need to remember when you're doing in the background, when you're adding, obviously, you know, shapes get darker because you can't really see them, they kind of blend together. So when you have to add that shadow, you would generally make your shadow through by using marks that are really close together. All right, so let's start off then. You can just use a normal pencil, you can use a biro. I have also got some ink with me today. If you've got ink at home, you can use ink. With your marks, try and be imaginative with what it is that you're creating. For the sake of this demonstration, I'm just going to do some very, very quick marks mimicking Van Gogh's here. Alright, so in the foreground, I want you to get into practice that these marks are generally a little bit bigger. Okay, and they're further apart. Alright, you can add different layers if you want to challenge yourself a little bit more, and you could press on harder. Okay, and you could press on lighter as well to create that layering effect. Okay, so you've got 2 layers there because you've pressed on lightly and you've pressed on hard. If you want to add a third layer, you can then use medium pressure. But then the problem there is you'd end up with your marks starting to get a little bit cluttered, and you don't want them to be cluttered in the foreground. Okay, in the middle ground then, all right, we need to be looking around about here, okay, because this bit in the landscape, all of those generally are quite large marks. Here they're starting to get a little bit smaller. That's why you can tell that it's the middle ground. Okay, so in the middle ground then, let's mimic the same mark. Okay, and we're going to do them just a little bit smaller, a little bit closer together, but sometimes they might come a bit further apart. Okay, and then in the background, you are starting to look at these marks getting a lot smaller. You can start pressing on quite a lot harder to create that shadow and the depth. Okay, so what I would like you to do is have a go using a wide variety of marks. Don't just do the same mark over and over again. You're going to do 3 boxes of the same mark, trying to get used to doing foreground, middle ground and background. Okay, have some control. Right? Make sure with mark making in a landscape you have got full control over what you're doing. Okay, but I should be able to see with every mark them far apart, getting a bit closer and a bit shorter, potentially, or smaller, and then they're very, very short. So here you can't really tell much of a difference between the two. So you've really got to be paying careful attention to maybe these need to be, okay, just that little bit closer, but also maybe do they need to be a bit shorter? Have I done them a bit too long? Okay, so really concentrate on that. I would suggest that you maybe do 6, 7, 8 different marks, taking them, as I say, from your marks in your sketchbook or your loose pieces of paper. Try and mimic these marks as much as you possibly can. Okay, eventually then you should have a full page, all right, where your marks are very, very different. So they're bigger, they're getting smaller, they're much smaller. All right, these are quite far apart. This one was quite a tough one to do. Okay, and they are very close here. Okay, please don't worry about the marks too much. Don't worry about them not being perfectly representative of a landscape, because as you can see with Van Gogh, if you just took this section here, it wouldn't look like much. All right, but when you put it together as an entire landscape, it actually looks quite a lot better. All right, so you don't have to use this image by Van Gogh. You can use a wide variety. If you just type into Google mark making landscapes, you'll actually get quite a few. All right, so what we're going to do now then is I have provided you, it's stuck, I have provided you with a very, very grayscale template that you can work on top of, as I have done here. Alright, so You can work on top of the one that I provided. You can find one off the internet if you want. All right, remember this is only an introduction. If you're feeling really, really confident, get out there in your back garden. Have a go at drawing your back garden, but please don't worry about getting it in proportion. Don't worry about the distance, creating distance through your drawing. I just want you to focus on creating distance with your marks. So if you are going to draw your garden, don't worry if their hedge, when you're drawing it looks too close together. All right, just try and create that distance with the marks. Okay, so what we're now going to do then is I am going to use the marks that I've done with the rubbing, and I'm going to use the marks from Van Gogh. Okay, and I'm going to somehow try and create distance using... I'm going to use ink to draw with, basically just because Van Gogh has used it and I think it's interesting. Right, so first things first, I am going to get comfortable, all right, with the ink, okay, and I'm going to start using using the paintbrush, getting used to how the ink moves. You can do this with a pencil as well. All right, ink is quite difficult for some. All right, it's quite difficult to do tighter marks, but what I am going to do is on here, I'm going to give you a couple of demonstrations, okay? All right, so I've gone over, all right, what I would now call, the best thing with this image is very, very easy to be able to tell between the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. You can easily divide that into 3. All right, so here you've got to have your marks quite far apart. Okay, very big. Here, with all the trees and the house, they are getting a bit closer together. And then in the distance, in the hills, they're really, really close together. Okay, so have a look at how you can, what texture, what material, what marks you can use in this landscape. Again, look at Google, have a look in your garden, see if you can work out how you can create the effects from the hedge, for example. Add in anything that you want to with this. Okay, I'm just going to add a few. All right, grass verges. Now, as I'm starting to get into the distance, naturally, these marks are going to get a little bit smaller, but please remember it's still the foreground. Okay, so you want these marks to be quite big. Okay, so trying to add a little bit of soil effect in there. Again, I don't want you to worry too much at this point about your mark. Okay, don't worry that maybe you don't know that that's grass, you can't quite tell. All right, this is an introduction. I just want you to worry about trying to create the distance, all right, with those marks. So if that's as far as you get and you're confident with that, then that's fine. Okay, what I am now going to do is I'm going to use the pencil to show how you can use create distance with that. All right, so with your pencil, remember this now is the middle ground. Again, foreground, middle ground, background. All right, just for those of you that are really interested, this is the horizon line here, and I'm going to be talking about the horizon line quite a lot. So it's that line there where the sky meets the land. All right, and when we come into learning about perspective, that is going to be really quite important. Okay, so again, these marks need to get a little bit closer together. Okay, but not quite as close together as they would do in these mountains. All right, now in order to create shadow, to create depth, you can slightly shade with this, but you shade in a mark making technique. So no tree is one mark or one consistency of mark. Right. Alright, so you can work into it quite easily with marks to create that depth. Okay, So that's with a pencil. In the background then, okay, your marks start to become very small. Okay. And I do want you to slightly over exaggerate some of these marks. Alright, you can notice as well in Van Gogh's work that they gets quite a lot darker. Alright, so it may be that you decide to press on a little bit harder in some instances. Try not to do the marks straight. Okay, try and follow the shape of the mountain. Remember to vary your pressure, which adds layering into the work. Okay, so here you can see the marks are very close together. Here they're medium sized. And the medium size, you can change the shape, change the style of your mark, alright, depending on the tree. Just remember that your marks in the middle ground are further apart, and it is hard because you always want to work to create that create that effect. You always want to work quite small. If you do make an error, okay, you can just lengthen some of those marks by using a rubber. Okay, and lightening it. Alright, so I'll show you the last one. The ink that I've used is quite shiny, so it's sticking to the paper. Alright, so as I've mentioned, I've exaggerated this slightly. Alright, so here we've got really quite large marks, large grass. Okay, the marks are starting to get a little bit smaller. Okay, a bit closer together. Alright, and then these here, they are much smaller, and that's what creates the distance. Now what I have done as well is I've also used a white pen to go over the top. You can use white chalk or you can use white charcoal, alright, just to break up that middle ground a little bit more so that there is a distinction between the three. So your aim is to try and create a distinction between the three middle grounds, okay? So, foreground, midground, okay, and then you've got your background. Background does not include the sky in this instance. Okay, good luck. Show me what you've got when you do it. Okay, thank you. Have a lovely evening. Have a lovely weekend. And I'll do the next session next week. Bye.